All cells also fall into 3 specific domains of life. These domains are archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. And so this is eukaryotic cells, and then these two are prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells also give rise to 3 kingdoms of life. These are Animalia, Plantae, and fungi. So here we see on the top the 2 prokaryotic domains, bacteria and archaea. Bacteria are the more common, or what you're probably more familiar with, those bacteria that live in and on us, for instance. Archaea tend to be found in more extreme environments, so they're sometimes known as extremophiles. And then the eukarya down here include the plants, the fungi, and the animals. Protists are not a separate kingdom. So sometimes some people have learned in the past that protists, this group of single-celled eukaryotes, are a kingdom, but they're not a kingdom. Members of this group fall into these are evolutionarily either more closely related to animals, more closely related to fungi, or more closely related to plants. So they should not be viewed as a separate kingdom. So one of the properties of living things is that they are all united with some functions, some features that they all share. So the most significant commonality that all living things share is DNA as their genetic material, and the information carried in DNA is common for all living things. So the DNA code is universal. So the structure, function, and meaning of DNA is universal in all living things. So that's probably the most important piece of evidence that suggests that all living things share a common ancestor. And then, of course, as I described before, all living things are made of cells. Cells all share some common features. And then, of course, there are some differences as well. So the diversity of life comes in how plants are different from animals, bacteria are different from eukaryotes, but the commonalities that underlie that are the unities of life. So evolution explains both the unity and the diversity of living things. And as a famous scientist once said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So when we think about evolution, what we mean is that all of life shares a common ancestor, and that over time, organisms evolve and change due to adaptations to their environment. And this theory of evolution by natural selection was, of course, coined by Darwin. And so we'll spend some time later in the semester going into this theory a little bit more, but it's really something that we cover in a lot more detail in the second semester course. I'd encourage you to watch the pocket mouse video that's in the lesson, because it talks about more specifically, using a specific example, about evolution by natural selection. This is the link for that video. So in the pocket mouse video, the subject is really these 2 mice that live in grassland or in an environment where there is both light-colored rocks and dark-colored rocks. And over time, the mice that lived on the dark-colored rocks evolved to have much darker fur. So where's the information that gives rise to the different color fur in the mice? It's really in their genetic information, right? It's information that's passed from one mouse to its offspring in the form of DNA. So let's talk a little bit about how DNA acts as genetic information. DNA is, of course, your genes. And the function of genes is to give rise to traits like dark fur versus light fur. So DNA comes in the form of a double helix molecule. It's a double-stranded molecule that has complementary base pairs. So this is showing one strand here. The opposite strand would have a thymine here, a guanine here, because A base pairs with T and C base pairs with G, an adenine here, a thymine here, and so on like that. So in a double-stranded molecule, there are two strands with these complementary sequences. And the function of DNA is to provide the code for making a temporary copy of itself known as RNA. And then that temporary RNA copy is used to direct the synthesis of proteins. And then it's proteins that determine whether the mouse has dark coat or a light coat. So the information in DNA gives rise to proteins, and then the protein gives rise to a specific trait. So this process is what's sometimes referred to as the central dogma of molecular biology, that DNA gives the instructions for making RNA, and then RNA gives the instructions for making proteins. So genes provide the instructions for making proteins most of the time. The DNA, of course, is found in the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell and is transmitted from one cell to the next when the cells divide. And so the genetic information is found in all cells and is propagated as cells divide. It ends up being in all the cells of your body and gives rise to all of your inherited traits. So that central dogma I just mentioned before, here's our DNA structure again. Here's a process of converting that DNA to this temporary RNA copy. This is known as transcription. This is a term I want you to know. And then the RNA is converted to protein in a process known as translation. Also a concept I want you to know. So for now, we're going to go through this in a lot more detail later in this semester, but for now, know that DNA to RNA is transcription and RNA to protein is translation. So this is the process of gene expression. So DNA to RNA is transcription, RNA to protein is translation. Again, the genetic information helps explain both the unity of life and the diversity of life. These three organisms are all birds. They all have some specific characteristics due to the fact that they're birds. They share a common ancestor that was a bird. So those characteristics of birds are found in all three of these organisms. But they also have some distinct differences between them. So the red-tailed hawk and the penguin are quite different from each other due to the environment in which they live, because they have over time adapted to their individual environments. So that evolution can explain both the unity of life, why these three characteristics have similarities, three organisms have similar characteristics, and the diversity of life, why they also have evolved to have some distinct differences between them. So the basic theory of natural selection is descent with modification. How does it work? So within a population, individuals vary within their traits. Most of the traits within those populations are heritable traits. And so with a population of, say, penguins that have some heritable differences between them, that's sort of the raw material for evolution. Within that same population, more offspring are typically produced than can survive and reproduce. So there's some competition among the penguins for who gets to survive and reproduce. And species generally get more suited to their environment over time. So Darwin reasoned then this theory of natural selection, that over time, the individuals who are more suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. And thus, over time, the organisms, the populations will become more adapted or suited to their environment. So this is the theory of natural selection. So you can see that exemplified here with these insects that have different coloration patterns and an environment that's dark in color. And the lighter colored insects are more visible than the darker colored insects, so they're more likely to be consumed and not survive, leaving a population that's darker colored, which over time reproduces and produces other darker colored insects. And so this population of insects becomes more adapted to their environment over time. That's evolution by natural selection. Evolutionary relationships are also often drawn in tree diagrams. This is an example of a phylogenetic tree. When you look at these trees, what they show you is that these two organisms have a common ancestor that was back in time somewhere along here. Time is going to be on the x-axis of these trees. And these two organisms also have a common ancestor that was back in time here. These four organisms share this common ancestor. And this organism up here is an outlier. It's the most distantly related compared to all the rest of these. So the fact that these two are next to each other on this tree is irrelevant. You've got to look back in time to see where their common ancestor was. So the common ancestor of this one is way back here. So you could imagine rotating at this point, this whole table, and this guy could be at the top next to this green warbler, and it would still be the same information. Last thing in this chapter is to talk a little bit about the nature of science and how science is a way of understanding the world, how scientific inquiry involves making observations, from those observations developing a set of testable questions, hypotheses, and then testing those questions to either support or reject the hypothesis. So scientists, like I said, observe what's going on in the environment, ask questions about what's happening in the environment, and then form hypotheses and test those hypotheses and either support or reject the hypothesis. We're going to get a lot of practice with this in lab as we go through the semester, but you should be familiar with the basics of scientific thinking. Hypotheses have to be testable and falsifiable, but they can't be proven. And so we don't say we've proven something, we say that our experiment provides support for our hypothesis. Hypothesis is a testable question. It's an explanation on trial, and it must be testable. You can't have a non-falsifiable hypothesis. So here's an example. You have a lamp that doesn't work. Why doesn't the lamp work? The bulb is burned out, the lamp is broken. You could think of other hypotheses as well. The electricity is off, and you can test those hypotheses, right? Or the outlet isn't working. All of those are testable. A ghost broke my lamp is not a testable hypothesis. It could not be falsified. So you have to have a hypothesis that's testable and falsifiable. So you could test this by trying another light bulb. You could test this by moving your light bulb into another lamp. You could test your outlet by plugging something else into the outlet to help either reject your hypothesis. So if the light bulb works in another lamp, you could reject this hypothesis, and that would in turn support this hypothesis. Hypotheses are not conclusively proven to be true because there are sometimes alternatives we're not aware of, but they can support. So that's the word I will ask you to use when you talk about results of your experiment. Does this support your hypothesis or reject your hypothesis? And like I said, you can't have a hypothesis that's not testable. When you have a controlled experiment, you usually have a single variable separating your experimental and your control setup. So if you wanted to test the idea that the dark mice were dark on the lava fields because it provided them camouflage, you could set up an experiment where you scattered some mice models in an environment, put some dark mice models and some light mice models in the same environment, and then asked what was the likelihood that those decoy mice were attacked by predators. This would be a controlled experiment. The experimental group would be the non-camouflage, the control group would be the camouflaged mice, and then you can test whether there is a difference in the attack rate between these two mice. These variables are known as independent variables, the color of the mice, and then the dependent variables, the attack rate, is not the thing you're not controlling. So a controlled experiment always has a control and an experimental group, and the variables are independent, the one you control, and dependent, the one that's the outcome of the experiment. Last concept is the theory and what it means in science versus what it means in everyday language. In science, theory is broader in scope than a hypothesis. It leads to many testable hypotheses, and it's supported by a large body of evidence. So when we say the theory of evolution, that means that it is has been supported by large numbers of experiments and a large body of evidence. That's different from your colloquial saying, I have this theory that the Mavericks are going to go to the playoffs this year, right? That's just an idea you have, but theory in science, theory of relativity, the theory of evolution means that it's supported by a large body of evidence.